What if I told you that the only state-owned bank, the only state-owned milling facility, and, arguably the most successful socialist-style political uprising in American history didn't happen in some progressive stronghold like New York or California?
I mean, most people would probably assume you were making that up.
Right. What if I told you it actually happened right in the middle of rural conservative North Dakota? And it was spearheaded by a coalition of incredibly angry wheat farmers.
It completely shatters the conventional assumptions we have about American political geography. You know, people look at a map, they see the upper Midwest, and they just assume a certain kind of quiet, static predictability.
Exactly.
But the actual historical record is far more complex and, frankly, far more ruthless.
So welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. You, the listener, the ultimate learner, reached out to us with a very specific mission. You want us to completely rewire your understanding of North Dakota.
Yeah, and you provided this totally fascinating stack of historical sources, agricultural data, and political records.
And you asked us to focus on three distinct pillars. First, you wanted to know how the raw physical and economic landscape was forged by railroads, bonanza farming, and the modern oil boom.
Second, you asked us to unpack the mechanics of that surprising agrarian populism. I mean, we really need to look closely at a group called the Nonpartisan League and examine exactly how they managed to hijack a political party.
And basically rewire local government from the inside out.
Right.
And third, you wanted the ultimate newcomer's guide. So, if someone is moving to the state today, what is the essential cultural and environmental history they absolutely need to know?
To understand their new neighbors and the land they're standing on.
Okay, let's unpack this. But before we take the plunge, we have to establish a very clear ground rule for this deep dive.
Oh, yeah, an absolute necessity given the source material we're working with today.
Because we're going to be dissecting some incredibly intense political movements. I mean, we will be analyzing radical left-wing agrarian populism, and we'll be examining staunch right-wing anti-globalist isolationism.
Which is a wild mix.
It is. So we want to assure you right up front, we are not taking sides here. We are not endorsing any of these political platforms or viewpoints.
No, our job is simply to impartially analyze the historical facts exactly as they are presented in the source text.
Right. We just want to understand the mechanisms of these movements and how they shape the state without, litigating the politics ourselves.
Our focus is on the why and the how, not on rendering moral judgments. And if we truly want to understand why these later generations of farmers and politicians reacted the way they did, we can't start in the 19th century.
No, we have to go way back.
We have to start with the environmental reality of the land itself. To understand North Dakota, you have to understand the people who originally mastered it. That sets the absolute baseline for every newcomer who ever stepped foot on the prairie.
So let's wind the clock back thousands of years. Long before any European surveyor drew a rectangular border on a map, this vast, imposing landscape was successfully navigated and managed by Native American tribes.
Specifically, the Mandan, the Hidatsa, the Arikara, the Sioux, and the Chippewa.
And I use the word managed very intentionally here. One detail from the sources completely stopped me in my tracks. It noted that these indigenous groups utilized at least 349 different kinds of plants.
Yeah, that number requires us to pause and really consider what it implies. 349 distinct plants.
It's massive.
We aren't just talking about casual foraging. Identifying, processing, and utilizing that many plant species represents a highly structured intergenerational botanical science.
They had basically mapped the biological utility of the entire region.
Exactly. They knew precisely which roots yielded complex medicines, which berries and stalks could be processed into permanent dyes,
which fibers possessed the tensile strength required for weaving rope.
And, of course, how to maximize caloric output for food.
It is an encyclopedic knowledge of a landscape that most outsiders just assume is empty grass. And among these groups, the Mandan specifically emerge in the early historical record as something entirely unexpected to the first Europeans.
Right. By the time European trade networks were just beginning to probe the interior of the continent, the Mandan had constructed a highly advanced agricultural and commercial society.
The sources detail the arrival of the first European explorer, a French-Canadian named La Vérendrye, in 1738. He walked onto the plains, expecting to find a scattering of nomadic temporary camps.
Instead, he found heavy infrastructure. I mean, he documented large, permanent, heavily fortified villages.
Wow.
Yeah, these weren't temporary settlements. They were permanent earth-lodged cities supported by a massive, reliable agricultural surplus.
But what's fascinating here is understanding why the Mandan, out of all the groups, were able to build such a dominant commercial empire.
It wasn't just agricultural skill, it was an absolute masterclass in geographic strategy.
So let's talk about that geography, because the physical map is everything here. Their villages were built right at the northernmost reaches of the Missouri River.
Precisely. And if you look at a topographical map of North America, that specific bend in the Missouri River is the critical choke point.
Right.
Because it places them closer than anyone else to the overland portages that lead straight into the Hudson Bay Basin.
And just for anyone who might not be familiar with the term, a portage is a stretch of land where you have to physically carry your canoes and cargo from one river system to another.
Right.
So by controlling that specific bend in the river, the Mandan were essentially sitting on the most efficient highway connecting the southern river systems to the northern river system.
Exactly. It gave them the absolute fastest, most direct access to the French and British traders operating out of the north. They became the indispensable middlemen.
You know, I was trying to visualize this when I read the source material, and I couldn't help but think of them as the 18th century equivalent of Amazon distribution centers.
That is a highly accurate way to conceptualize it.
Right. Like if you wanted European goods, guns, kettles, metal tools to flow south, or if you wanted agricultural surplus and pelts to flow north. It all had to be routed through these permanent, perfectly located logistical hubs managed by the Mandan.
They controlled the flow of goods across trade networks that span the entire continent.
And on top of that geographic monopoly, they also controlled a crucial local manufacturing resource.
Ah, yes, Knife River flint.
Yeah. This was the premium material for crafting sharp, durable tools and weapons before the widespread introduction of metallurgy.
So they're sitting at the crossroads of international trade, holding the premium raw materials and feeding everyone with their agricultural surplus.
That level of permanence, that absolute mastery of the environmental and geographic realities, it defined the region for centuries. But as we pivot into the 19th century, that reality undergoes a violent systemic shift.
It does. Through a series of negotiations, pressures, and treaties with the expanding United States government, the territory of these indigenous tribes was fundamentally redefined and restricted.
And by 1861, this massive geographic space was officially incorporated into the newly created Dakota Territory.
Which presents the federal government and territorial officials with a massive logistical problem.
Oh, a huge one. They've just drawn a border around an ocean of grass that experiences brutally cold winters.
Yeah, and they need American citizens to move there to secure the territory. But how do you convince someone sitting in a comfortable, established city on the East Coast to pack up their family and move to an untamed, freezing prairie?
You definitely can't just tell them the truth about the weather.
No, absolutely
Yeah.
not. You need to launch a marketing campaign. You basically need to manufacture a myth.
The myth of North Dakota.
Yeah.
And it was a highly organized, state-sponsored propaganda effort. Territorial officials produced pamphlets, commissioned glowing newspaper accounts.
And they distributed them not just across the eastern United States, but deep into Europe. They were selling a highly curated 3-part fantasy to anyone who would listen.
Let's break down the psychology of this marketing pitch, because it is brilliant in its manipulation. The first pillar was the myth of the garden. They deliberately painted this picture of an Eden-like agricultural paradise. The brochures promised a climate that was actually gentle and soil so rich that you merely had to drop a seed in the dirt and wait to harvest your fortune.
The second pillar appealed directly to the ego and the American ethos. It was the work and win philosophy.
Pure American dream stuff.
Exactly. This was the pure, unadulterated promise of the American dream. The literature insisted that the only barrier to immense wealth was your own laziness.
If you were willing to put your head down and toil, the land guaranteed home ownership, social mobility, and total financial independence.
And the third pillar gave it all a sense of moral destiny. They promoted the image of an empire in the making, settled exclusively by good, just, and moral people.
So it wasn't just a real estate pitch. It was an invitation to build a righteous civilization.
Come to the garden, work hard, win big, and build a moral empire.
It's intoxicating.
It is. But as any modern business person will tell you, a marketing pitch is entirely useless without a distribution network.
Yeah, you can print all the pamphlets about the myth of the garden that you want, but physically transporting tens of thousands of humans and their farming equipment out onto that grass requires infrastructure that simply did not exist.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the actual engine of this entire historical era, Who is building the roads to this manufactured paradise?
The answer, dominating the late 19th century, is the corporate railroad industry. Without the railroads, the state of North Dakota as a political and demographic entity does not exist.
They triggered what historians call the Dakota boom of the 1870s and 1880s.
And the demographic explosion detailed in the sources is almost difficult to wrap your head around. In 1870, the recorded population of the entire Dakota Territory was roughly 11,766 people.
Okay.
Just 20 years later, by 1890, it had surged to over 320,000.
That isn't just growth. That is a tidal wave of humanity.
Yeah.
I mean, the number of active farms went from 1,700 to over 50,000. Town sites multiplied from 6 to 310.
It was this specific railroad-engineered influx that gave the territory the population density required to split into North and South Dakota and achieve full statehood in November of 1889.
But what I find truly fascinating is looking under the hood at how the railroad companies pulled this off. Because we're looking at two major corporate players here, the Northern Pacific Railroad and the Great Northern Railroad. And their business models were completely opposed to one another.
Let's examine the mechanics of the Northern Pacific first, because their strategy relied heavily on federal subsidy.
Right.
The United States government desperately wanted a transcontinental rail link, so they offered the Northern Pacific massive land grants.
And the mechanism worked like this. The government gave the railroad company ownership of alternating sections of land along their proposed route. It looked like a giant checkerboard.
Yes.
The railroad could then use this vast real estate portfolio as collateral to borrow the immense capital required to actually lay the steel tracks.
While the government held onto the remaining checkerboard squares to offer directly to homesteaders.
On paper, it sounds like a brilliant public-private partnership. The railroad gets collateral, the government gets the infrastructure built, and settlers get land.
On paper, yes. But the sources highlight a massive initial miscalculation by the Northern Pacific. Building a railroad burns through cash at an astonishing rate. They were deeply in debt to bondholders.
Oh, right.
Furthermore, owning millions of acres of land meant they were liable for massive annual property taxes.
That's a huge burden.
So to generate immediate liquidity and shed that tax burden, the Northern Pacific essentially panicked. They sold off enormous tracts of their land grants at dirt cheap, wholesale prices to wealthy land speculators and corporate investors.
So they just dumped their greatest asset for pennies on the dollar to make payroll.
Exactly. But the corporate leadership eventually realized the magnitude of their error. They were giving away the future value of the region. So by 1905, they completely inverted their strategy.
They stopped the wholesale dumping.
Yes. Instead, they focused on providing reliable train service and actively teaching arriving settlers improved farming methods.
Because if the farmers succeeded, the value of the remaining land skyrocketed.
Right. The Northern Pacific began selling land they had once deemed worthless directly to actual farmers at premium retail prices.
They woke up and realized they weren't just running a transportation company. They were running a massive real estate development firm.
Exactly.
Now, I want to contrast that heavily subsidized model with James J. Hill and the Great Northern Railroad.
Exactly.
Because this is where the story takes a turn into sheer corporate aggression.
Oh, definitely.
James J. Hill received absolutely zero land grants from the federal government, not a single acre.
Which is a profound structural disadvantage. I mean, if you don't have free land to use as collateral, you have to operate with ruthless efficiency.
Exactly. Hill had to purchase every inch of his right-of-way directly from the government or private owners. And because he didn't have a massive portfolio of free land to sell to settlers, he couldn't just sit back and wait for the government to advertise the homesteads.
He had to actively hunt for customers.
He set up recruitment agencies in Germany. He set up offices in Scandinavia. He was running an international marketing machine.
Printing glossy brochures in foreign languages.
And offering heavily subsidized low-cost transatlantic tickets to bring entire families from the old world directly onto his rail lines in the new world.
He was vertically integrating his customer base. He understood the fundamental economic reality of his business. A railroad track laid across an empty prairie generates zero revenue.
Right, you need stuff to haul.
Exactly. He needed human beings out there harvesting wheat to load into his freight cars. And this desperate need to control territory and secure a customer base culminated in one of the most aggressive corporate conflicts in Western history.
The Railway War of 1905.
The 1905 Railway War.
This detail in the sources feels like a cutthroat boardroom drama. You have James J. Hill's Great Northern going head-to-head with Edward Pennington, who was running the rival Soo Line Railroad.
They both realized that whoever controls the northern tier of North Dakota controls the future freight revenue of that entire region.
So they engage in a frantic, no-holds-barred race to lay down tracks and clean the territory before the other guy can.
This rivalry results in almost 500 miles of new track being spiked into the dirt and over 50 completely new town sites being platted on maps in a single year.
It was an explosion of infrastructure driven entirely by corporate animosity and the desire to blockade a rival, rather than any organic human demand for those towns.
But wait, I struggle to call that a war or even a mistake, as some historians imply. I have to push back here. Weren't these railroads just aggressively laying down the necessary infrastructure for the future of the state?
I mean, even if the motivation was corporate spite, laying 500 miles of track connects the region to Chicago and the Pacific. Isn't this just a brutal but necessary national growing pain?
That is the argument the railroad executives made, sure. But look at the actual mechanism of what they were doing on the ground. They weren't carefully planning logistical hubs. They were rushing out, finding an empty patch of grass, dropping a grid on a map, and calling it a town purely to secure the right-of-way and prevent the rival railroad from building a spur line through that specific valley.
Wow.
They were platting towns where there was no reliable water source, no geographic advantage, and no economic reason for a human being to live there.
So they're basically weaponizing urban planning. They're dropping fake towns like landmines to block the other company's expansion.
Precisely. And the sources confirm the grim reality of this tactic. Because there was no organic reason for these places to exist, many of these 50 town sites were never settled at all.
They were just coordinates on a corporate ledger.
Once the war ended and the territory was divided up, the railroad companies abandoned them. They became instant ghost towns, leaving nothing but empty grids slowly being swallowed back by the prairie grass.
That is a haunting image. Corporate ambition literally scarred into the earth and then abandoned. But while those specific tactical ghost towns failed, the broader strategy worked. The trains brought in waves of real people.
Yeah, they really did.
But that leads me to a major question. Think about the psychology of a family who reads a glossy brochure in Germany, boards a steamship, takes a train to the end of the line, and steps out onto a freezing, windswept plain. How do they actually adapt to the stark reality of the land once the myth of the garden violently collides with a North Dakota winter?
Well, to answer that, we have to examine the complex cultural fabric of the state during this massive 19th century boom, because the people stepping off those trains were not a monolith.
No.
The demographic data from the period reveals a deeply divided, almost bifurcated society. Broadly speaking, you had two distinct groups attempting to build a life here. On one side, you had the Yankees.
And these were native-born Americans, mostly migrating from the East Coast or the established Midwest.
Right. And the Yankees generally didn't come to break the sod. They concentrated in the newly formed towns and cities. They were the merchants setting up shops, the bankers issuing loans, the lawyers, the civic leaders.
They were importing the social structures of the East Coast directly into the prairie towns.
Exactly. They controlled the capital and the municipal power. But out on the physical land, doing the agonizing, backbreaking physical labor of turning wild grass into commercial wheat fields, you had the immigrants.
And this population was primarily composed of German Americans and Scandinavian Americans.
However, within that massive immigrant wave, the sources isolate a highly distinct, deeply fascinating subgroup that requires our attention because of the profound impact they had on the state's culture and agriculture.
The Germans from Russia.
Yes.
Their story is incredible. If you're listening to this and assuming these are just standard German immigrants who decided to cross the ocean, you are missing one of the most bizarre geopolitical detours in history.
That's quite a detour.
Let's really dive into the Germans from Russia. Because they weren't migrating from Munich or Berlin. They'd been living deep inside the Russian Empire, primarily along the Volga River and the Black Sea, for generations.
Right. To understand why they ended up in North Dakota, we actually have to rewind to the 1760s. Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia, who was actually German by birth, wanted to secure the wilder frontiers of the Russian Empire and modernize their archaic agricultural practices.
So she explicitly invited these advanced German farmers to immigrate into Russia.
And she offered them an incredible deal. Total exemption from military conscription, exemption from taxes for decades, and the absolute right to maintain their German language, their schools, and their religion.
They were essentially allowed to operate as autonomous German microstates deep inside Russian territory, and they thrived there for over a century.
But eventually, the political winds in Russia shifted. By the 1870s, Tsar Alexander II decided to revoke those special privileges.
He initiated a policy of Russification.
Yes, they began forcing the German schools to teach in Russian, and most terrifyingly for these pacifist farming communities, they instituted a military draft, forcing German men into the Russian army.
So, faced with the erosion of their culture and the threat of conscription, these communities made the agonizing decision to uproot themselves again. Between roughly 1890 and the outbreak of the First World War, an estimated 100,000 of them fled the Russian Empire and immigrated to the Great Plains of the United States.
In North Dakota, they settled in massive numbers in the south-central part of the state, an area that quickly became known as the German-Russian Triangle.
Now, what is crucial for a newcomer to understand is that these people did not view themselves as typical German Americans. They had a completely different, shared, historical trauma.
They had survived on the Russian steppes by fiercely protecting their isolation, and they brought that exact same defensive cultural posture to North Dakota.
They settled in tight-knit, insular communities. They continued to speak their specific dialects of German. They raised exceptionally large families to ensure enough labor for the farms.
They built incredibly distinctive, austere German-style churches on the prairie, and they buried their dead using these beautiful, intricate, hand-wrought iron grave markers that you can still see in the cemeteries today.
They were determined to remain a people apart, and agriculturally, they brought a specific expertise that permanently altered the regional economy.
While the Yankees and the Bonanza farms focused almost exclusively on wheat, many of the Germans from Russia possessed the intense, labor-driven expertise required to cultivate sugar beets.
Which is not a crop you just casually throw on the ground.
No, it requires grueling manual labor to thin and harvest, but it paid off. Sugar beets remain a massive, incredibly lucrative pillar of the Upper Great Plains agricultural economy to this very day.
They literally changed the agricultural DNA of the state.
They did. But their desire for cultural isolation eventually collided violently with global geopolitics. The sources make it clear that assimilation was largely forced upon them.
When the United States entered World War I against Germany and later World War II, a wave of intense, sometimes hysterical anti-German sentiment swept across the country.
Suddenly, speaking German in a rural North Dakota town wasn't just a cultural quirk. It was viewed as highly suspect, unpatriotic, and in some cases, physically dangerous.
The pressure to prove their Americanness was immense. The sources note that by the end of the Second World War, the public use of the German language in these communities went into a steep and terminal decline.
Today, the descendants of the Germans from Russia speak English, though you can still hear echoes of the old dialects in some traditional, localized singing groups.
So you have this landscape completely transformed by incredibly hardworking immigrant populations.
Yeah.
And they're operating in an environment where agriculture is rapidly shifting from subsistence farming to aggressive commercialization.
This is the era of the Bonanza farms.
These were not the romanticized small family homesteads we like to picture. These were massive, highly corporatized, mechanized wheat farming operations, sometimes spanning tens of thousands of acres.
And they were heavily promoted and often owned by the railroad executives and Eastern investors.
Because the railroads needed massive guaranteed volume to make their freight lines profitable. A guy with a mule and 40 acres doesn't fill a train. A corporate farm with an army of seasonal laborers and steam tractors fills a train.
But whether you were a laborer on a Bonanza farm or an immigrant family trying to prove up a small homestead, your survival was entirely tethered to the brutal realities of the local economy.
And if we really want to understand the simmering anger that defined early North Dakota, we have to look at the mechanics of daily survival.
Yes, the retail experience.
How people actually bought their food and clothing reveals everything you need to know about the staggering class divide in this society.
The contrast between the rural general store and the city department store is a perfect microcosm of the economic tension.
Let's examine the rural mechanism first.
The immigrant farmers out on the prairie were entirely dependent on small, independently owned, local general stores. These businesses operated on razor-thin margins. They had limited stock, inventory moved very slowly, and to survive, the store owner had to charge exorbitant retail prices.
But the most critical detail is this. There were no price tags.
None. The price of a sack of flour or a pair of boots wasn't fixed. You walked in, and you had to negotiate the price face-to-face with the owner.
And interestingly, the sources point out that in these rural communities, the men did almost all of the shopping, which seems counterintuitive to modern gender roles until you realize why. They weren't going into the store to browse.
No, they were going in to secure a line of credit.
Precisely. The rural economy was virtually cashless for most of the year. The farmers didn't have liquid capital until their wheat was harvested and sold in the fall.
So they had to buy a year's worth of supplies on credit, legally pledging their future crop against the ledger.
The general store owner wasn't merely a merchant. He was essentially an unregulated risk assessor.
His own financial survival depended entirely on his ability to accurately judge whether a specific farmer's crop was going to survive the drought, the hail, and the grasshoppers well enough to pay off the accumulated debt.
It was an entire economy built on a mountain of high-interest debt, fragile trust, and the absolute mercy of the weather. Every transaction in that store was fraught with existential tension.
Now take that anxiety-ridden, male-dominated rural negotiation and contrast it with what the Yankees were experiencing in the cities.
The urban elite were shopping at locally owned, multi-story department stores.
It is a completely different commercial universe. In the city department stores, you had a vast, curated selection of goods. And crucially, every single item had a tag with a firmly fixed price.
There was no haggling, no tense negotiations over the value of a future wheat crop.
And because it wasn't a credit-based economy, these transactions were primarily conducted in cash. The entire demographic of the customer base shifted.
The shoppers in the cities were largely middle-class and upper-class housewives. The stores intentionally catered to them. By 1900, these stores were investing heavily in attractive glass window displays to lure in foot traffic.
They hired experienced professional clerks who knew the intricacies of the products.
And these urban stores were deeply connected to the national commercial grid. They didn't rely on local barter. The owners would send their professional buyers out on the train to Denver, to Minneapolis, or all the way to Chicago once or twice a year.
To study the latest national merchandising trends and physically bring high fashion and luxury goods back to North Dakota.
Which is absolutely staggering when you place it side by side with the rural experience just a few miles outside of town.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? Let's look at the incredible friction we've just mapped out. You have the immigrant farmers out on the freezing prairie doing the brutal physical labor of wrestling wheat from the earth.
They are drowning in personal debt at the general store.
Entirely at the mercy of the weather, and completely hostage to whatever freight rates the railroad monopolies decide to charge them to move their grain.
Meanwhile, the city folks, the Yankee merchants, the bankers holding the mortgages, and the railroad barons control absolutely all of the capital.
They are shopping for Chicago fashions with cash, while the farmers beg for a sack of flour on credit. You don't have to be an economist to see that this is an unsustainable, explosive situation.
It is the textbook definition of a society ripe for a populist revolt. The agrarian class gradually woke up to the realization that the entire economic deck was structurally stacked against them.
The railroads charged exorbitant, unregulated rates to move their grain to market.
The local banks charged usurious interest rates on their loans, and the city middlemen, the grain elevator operators in Minneapolis, were taking a massive cut of the profit by manipulating the grading of the wheat.
And politically, they had no voice. The state government in its early decades was entirely dominated by the Republican Party, which was heavily aligned with those exact corporate and banking interests.
The very first governor of North Dakota, a man named John Miller, was quite literally a manager of one of those massive corporate bonanza farms.
So the ethnic immigrant farmers, particularly in the north central and northwestern parts of the state, felt completely exploited economically and entirely locked out politically. How do you fight back against a system that owns the banks, the trains, and the governor's mansion?
You fight back through radical, disciplined organization. In 1915, a new political entity is formed, the Nonpartisan League, widely known as the NPL.
And this is where the political history of North Dakota takes a turn that deeply confuses a lot of modern political observers.
The NPL was a movement rooted deeply in agrarian populism, and it found its strongest, most militant base of support among the Norwegian-American farmers.
But the leaders of the NPL were tactically brilliant.
Yeah.
They recognized a fundamental flaw in American politics. Third parties almost always fail.
They split the vote and die out.
So rather than forming a new farmers' party, they decided to operate as an insurgent faction within the dominant Republican Party. They essentially acted as a political Trojan horse.
They said, We aren't going to fight the Republicans in the general election. We are going to run our own radical pro-farmer candidates in the Republican primaries and simply take over the party apparatus from the inside.
It was the stroke of strategic genius. But their actual platform was truly revolutionary for the era. They didn't just want tighter regulations on the railroads or better interest rates.
No, they explicitly advocated for total state control, literal government ownership of the key industries that were exploiting the agrarian class.
They wanted the state government to step in and act as a massive counterweight to the power of out-of-state corporate monopolies.
Okay, let's really pause here and dig into this, because this is the concept that is hardest to reconcile with our modern political labels.
When most people think of North Dakota today, they think of a reliably conservative state that generally favors free market capitalism, deregulation, and smaller government.
But here we have the historical record from 1915 showing a massive coalition of conservative rural farmers successfully campaigning for the total government takeover of major industries.
That is, by any modern definition, a socialist platform being aggressively enacted by rural farmers. How do we make sense of that?
This raises an incredibly important question about how historical actors view their own motives versus how we label them retroactively. For these farmers, the NPL platform was not about embracing Marxist ideology or reading communist theory.
It was about raw, practical survival.
They were not attempting to overthrow capitalism as a concept. They firmly believed that capitalism, as it was currently being ruthlessly practiced by the railroad and milling monopolies in Minneapolis, was attempting to overthrow them.
They felt the free market had become a rigged monopoly.
Exactly. They viewed the state government as the only entity large enough and powerful enough to protect their private property, their family farms, from the predations of out-of-state corporate monopolies.
They wanted state socialism in specific sectors, purely to guarantee their own survival as independent capitalists.
We need the government to build a bigger stick so we can fight the railroad.
And the astonishing thing is, it worked. The NPL's electoral success was absolute. In 1916, running under the NPL banner, a farmer named Lynn Frazier won the governor's race with a staggering 79% of the popular vote.
By 1918, the NPL had swept the elections and won total control of both houses of the state legislature.
And unlike a lot of politicians, they didn't moderate once they got into power. They ruthlessly enacted their radical populist platform.
They systematically rewired the mechanics of the state government to serve the agrarian class. They established a state-owned railroad to force freight rates down. Most critically, they created the North Dakota Mill and Elevator.
Let's explain the mechanics of why that matters. Before this, farmers had to sell their grain to corporate elevators owned by Minneapolis cartels.
The corporate elevator would artificially grade the wheat poorly, claiming it was full of dirt or weeds, pay the farmer a fraction of its worth, and then turn around and sell it at a premium.
The farmer had no alternative.
Precisely. By building a state-owned mill and elevator, the government provided a massive, publicly owned alternative. Farmers could take their grain to a facility that guaranteed fair grading and fair market prices, effectively breaking the Minneapolis monopoly.
And it wasn't a temporary experiment. The North Dakota Mill and Elevator is still operating today.
As is the Bank of North Dakota, which the NPL also created. It remains, to this day, the only state-owned bank in the United States.
It was designed to act as a clearinghouse for public funds and to issue fair, low-interest agricultural loans directly to farmers, bypassing the predatory commercial banks.
But their legislative blitz didn't stop there. They established a home building association to provide state financing for residential construction.
They passed a highly progressive graduated state income tax that specifically distinguished between earned income, like the physical labor of farming, and unearned income, like stock dividends earned by Eastern investors.
They also authorized a state hail insurance fund. If a freak hailstorm wiped out your crop, the state provided a safety net so you didn't lose your land to the bank.
They also established a workmen's compensation fund. It is an incredibly aggressive, comprehensive legislative record achieved in a remarkably short amount of time.
And at the absolute center of this political machine is one of the most chaotic, colorful, and ruthless characters in North Dakota history, William Langer.
William Langer. It is virtually impossible to discuss the mechanics of North Dakota politics without analyzing the career of William Langer.
The sources outline his career trajectory, and it honestly reads like the script of a political thriller. He was a bit of an anomaly in the NPL because he was one of the few urban, college-educated lawyers in a movement dominated by dirt farmers.
He gets elected as the state attorney general on the NPL ticket in 1916, and he immediately proves himself to be a total wild card.
He views the law not as a subtle instrument, but as a sledgehammer. The sources note that he personally led raids to shut down illegal brothels in the city of Minot.
At another point, feeling constrained by state jurisdiction, he manages to get himself temporarily appointed as a federal marshal for the sole purpose of legally crossing state lines to raid a brewery operating in Minnesota.
He possessed a flair for the dramatic, but beneath the showmanship, he was a brilliantly ruthless political operator. As the NPL grew, Langer was instrumental in transforming it from a loose, grassroots agrarian movement into a highly disciplined, almost authoritarian political machine.
And his career reaches its absolute peak and its lowest, most criminal depths during the Great Depression. He managed to get himself elected governor in 1932 at the absolute nadir of the global economic crisis.
The state is literally blowing away in the Dust Bowl, wheat prices have collapsed to pennies, and farmers are losing their land to the banks by the thousands.
And what does Governor Langer do? He doesn't wait for the legislature. He takes unprecedented, massive executive action. He unilaterally declares a moratorium on all debt.
He legally halts all farm foreclosures in the state.
He even commands the state-owned grain elevator to institute an embargo, artificially raising the price of wheat paid to the state's farmers above the national market rate.
He essentially throws the entire sovereign weight of the state government between the desperate farmers and the eastern banks.
Which, understandably, elevated him to the status of a folk hero among the rural population. He was saving their generational livelihoods.
But his methods for maintaining power were highly corrupt and legally indefensible. To fund the NPL's primary political propaganda newspaper, Langer instituted a policy where he solicited, or rather systematically extorted, 5% of the annual salary of every single person employed by the state government.
It was a blatant shakedown. Donate 5% of your paycheck to my political paper or you'll be fired from your state job tomorrow.
Exactly. And that brazen extortion finally caught the attention of the federal government. Langer was indicted on federal conspiracy charges. He went to trial, was convicted, and was actually physically removed from the governor's office in 1934 under the threat of federal prison.
But the story doesn't end there.
Not at all. He launched a relentless series of appeals, eventually securing an acquittal on a technicality. He immediately ran for governor again in 1936, won the election, and then eventually elevated himself to the United States Senate, where he served from 1940 until his death in 1959.
That is absolutely wild to me. The guy gets federally indicted and removed from office for running an extortion ring on state employees, and the voters welcome him back with open arms and eventually promote him to Washington.
Yeah, it's quite a comeback.
Why? How do you explain that level of voter loyalty to a known corrupt official?
Because, as the historical sources astutely point out, the voters were making a calculated, pragmatic choice. They willingly overlooked his overt opportunism, the extortion, and the constant swirl of bribery rumors, because they remembered 1932.
During the darkest, most terrifying days of the Depression, when the banks were coming to take the land their parents had bled for, William Langer was the only politician who actually physically intervened to save them.
He stopped the foreclosures. To a starving farmer, a corrupt politician who abuses his power to save your farm is infinitely preferable to an honest politician who strictly follows the law and lets the bank take your home.
It's the ultimate triumph of pragmatism over ethical purity. He may be a crook, but he's our crook.
But speaking of political mechanisms and how they can be weaponized, we have to mention the incredible irony of the recall mechanism. What's fascinating here is that the NPL, in their initial idealistic push to strip power from the elites and give it back to the common people, championed and passed a law allowing for the popular recall of elected officials.
Right. The democratic theory being that if a politician betrays the will of the people, the public shouldn't have to wait for the next election cycle. They can organize a petition and vote to remove that official immediately.
Well, the historical irony is almost too perfect. The conservative opposition to the NPL eventually reorganized, studied the new laws, and utilized that exact same populist recall mechanism against the NPL.
And Lynn Frazier, the very NPL governor who championed and signed the recall into law, became the very first state governor in United States history to be successfully recalled and removed from office by the voters.
It is a flawless historical example of how systemic political tools have no loyalty. Once you create a mechanism of power, it can and will be wielded by your opponents.
Exactly. Now, as we move out of the trauma of the Great Depression and enter the 1940s and 50s, we see this intense laser focus on protecting the local agrarian way of life start to mutate.
It transitions from being strictly a local economic policy into a comprehensive philosophical lens through which the state views the entire rest of the world.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the radical agrarian populism of the NPL evolves directly into a fierce, incredibly unified congressional isolationist bloc.
In the post-WWII era, North Dakota's delegation in Washington, which included Senators William Langer and Milton Young, along with Representatives William Lemke and Usher Burdick, became some of the loudest, most persistent voices against American global interventionism in the entire country.
The sources list their voting records, and it is a comprehensive wall of no. They vehemently opposed the military buildup of the Cold War. They opposed the creation of the United Nations.
They voted against the Truman Doctrine. They voted against the financial aid of the Marshall Plan. They fought the formation of NATO. They opposed the Korean War.
Basically, if a treaty or a policy involved global entanglement, they fought it tooth and nail.
And again, we must ask why. It is very easy for modern observers to dismiss this voting record as simple backward contrarianism, but it was actually a deeply logical extension of the state's demographics and their specific economic trauma.
First, we have to remember the ethnic makeup we discussed earlier in the 19th century.
The deep-seated historical fears of the German and Scandinavian American populations played a massive, undeniable role here. These were communities who had literally fled Europe to escape militarism, endless wars, and forced conscription.
They had absolutely zero desire to see American wealth spent and American blood spilled, intervening in the very European conflicts they had sacrificed everything to escape.
And beyond the deep ethnic ties, there was a profound localized economic fear. Representative Usher Burdick, in particular, was a fascinating figure to read about.
He was a populist who deeply feared the spread of communism, yes, but he equally feared the concept of a world government, which he viewed as a direct existential threat to American sovereignty.
To Burdick and the farmers who voted for him, abstract diplomatic concepts like the United Nations or NATO weren't noble peacekeeping efforts. They were massive, unaccountable machines designed to drag rural boys into foreign wars.
And war, with its rationing, price controls, and conscription, was a direct, obvious danger to the state's fragile agricultural economy and their peaceful lifestyle.
They looked at the growing global order and essentially said, we just want to be left alone to farm.
They firmly believed that globalism only served the financial interests of the munitions manufacturers and the wealthy East Coast banking elites, the exact same people who had exploited them in the 1920s, while the rural farmers would inevitably be the ones paying the brutal price in higher taxes and lost sons.
Leave us alone to farm. It is a powerful, deeply ingrained sentiment. But the supreme irony of this era is that while these politicians were fighting tooth and nail in Washington to protect the traditional, independent farming lifestyle from external global threats, the farming lifestyle itself was being completely dismantled and rebuilt by technology right beneath their feet.
By 1956, the political landscape experiences a seismic shift as the remnants of the radical NPL finally merge into the mainstream Democratic Party. But far more importantly, the physical, day-to-day landscape of agriculture is transforming.
The post-war period brings rapid advances in agricultural technology. The widespread adoption of massive mechanization, gasoline, and diesel tractors replacing horses entirely, along with the massive introduction of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, fundamentally altered the economic math of farming.
The sources highlight a stark, undeniable trend in the data. The farms increased massively in total acreage, but they decreased dramatically in sheer numbers.
The era of the 160-acre family homestead was dead. You didn't need 50 guys with horse-drawn plows to harvest a section of land anymore. You needed one guy sitting in the air-conditioned cab of a massive combine harvester.
Exactly. The need for human labor plummeted. Farm tenancy diminished significantly. The types of crops being grown also shifted to maximize efficiency. Traditional cash grains were increasingly replaced by feed grains and roughage designed for livestock.
And furthermore, because of federal government interventions like the soil bank programs and strict wheat acreage allotments designed to prevent another collapse in prices, over 30% of the state's arable cropland wasn't even being planted or harvested.
So on an industrial level, the efficiency of the state goes through the roof. The standard of living for the mega farmers who managed to survive and consolidate land went up significantly.
But the human cost of that incredible agricultural efficiency is a devastating decline in the rural population. Fewer farms means fewer families.
Fewer families means the local general stores go bankrupt, the rural post offices close, and the schools and churches are forced to consolidate or board up their windows entirely.
For nearly a century, stretching from the end of the early pioneer boom days right up to the year 2000, the demographic data shows flat or actively declining population numbers in these vast rural counties.
It genuinely looked as though the state had long ago reached its peak ecological carrying capacity, realized it had overextended, and was slowly, painfully deflating back to a sustainable baseline.
But then, as history is so fond of doing, a massive new technological variable was introduced that completely violently reversed a century of established trends.
We jump forward to the dawn of the 21st century. The year 2000 hits, and suddenly the state experiences an explosion of growth that rivals the 1880s.
But this time, it isn't because of a new strain of drought-resistant wheat, and it isn't because of a new transcontinental railroad.
It is because of what was buried miles deep beneath the earth. The perfection of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing unlocked massive, previously inaccessible reserves of extractable oil in the Bakken Shale Formation in western North Dakota.
The Bakken oil boom, it triggered a modern-day hyper-industrialized gold rush. The demographic impact was instantaneous and staggering.
By 2013, the census reported that North Dakota's population had surged to hit an all-time historical high of 723,393 residents. A state that had been bleeding population for decades officially became the fastest-growing state in the entire nation.
It's an incredible whiplash-inducing reversal of fortune. Suddenly, you had this massive influx of newcomers flooding into the western counties, echoing the Dakota boom of the 1880s.
But the sources provide us with detailed sociological survey data on the profile of these modern migrants, and the reality completely upends expectations.
It really does defy the popular media stereotypes of a rough-and-tumble, lawless oil boom town filled entirely with transient roughnecks.
The survey data shows that these new residents are overwhelmingly young, which is vital for a state that had an aging demographic. 60% of the newcomers are between 21 and 40 years old.
Furthermore, they are highly educated. 45% hold four-year college degrees, and another 35% possess some college or specialized vocational training.
But here is the single most striking, counterintuitive fact from that survey data. When you ask these highly educated young people why they packed up their lives and moved to North Dakota, you would naturally assume the number one answer is money.
It's an oil boom. The salaries are huge.
But the data shows they're actually motivated more by intangible quality of life values than by pure economic incentives.
The survey asked them to rank their motivations. The top reasons they cited were a desire for a safer place to live, which 58% mention as a primary factor.
54% stated they wanted to be closer to relatives, indicating a return migration of people who had previously left.
48% were looking for a lower, more manageable cost of living compared to coastal cities. And remarkably, 47% specifically cited the quality of the natural environment as a major draw.
I really had to let that sink in when I read it. People are migrating to the absolute epicenter of a massive, heavy industrial oil boom. And almost half of them are doing it because they desire the quality of the natural environment.
It is such a fascinating paradox, but it makes a strange kind of historical sense when you zoom out. The desperate newcomers in the 1880s came because they were sold the romanticized myth of the garden.
The educated newcomers today are coming for a sense of physical safety, family proximity, and the stark beauty of the natural landscape. Despite all the advanced technology, the satellite-guided combines and the massive oil rigs, it all still fundamentally comes back to the psychological pull of the land.
It inevitably always comes back to the land, which brings us to the most controversial, the most hotly debated, and perhaps the most important historical theory about North Dakota's existence.
If we're going to synthesize all of this, the aggressive railroads, the radical MPL, the shrinking family farms, and the modern oil booms, we have to look at the work of a historian named Elwin B. Robinson.
He wrote what is still widely considered the only truly comprehensive, definitive history of the state.
And Robinson wasn't interested in just listing dates and governors. He attempted to identify the underlying DNA of the state. He identified 5 core themes that he believed define the North Dakota experience.
Dependence on outside forces, radicalism in politics, economic disadvantage due to geography, constant adjustment to the climate, and the highly controversial too much mistake.
The too much mistake. This is essentially the grand unifying theory of North Dakota history, according to Robinson, and it is a concept every resident must grapple with.
Okay, let's break this down clearly. What exactly is the too much mistake?
Robinson argued that during that initial frantic Dakota boom in the 1880s and 90s, driven by the deceptive myth of the garden and the hyper-aggressive corporate expansion of the rival railroads, North Dakota simply built too much infrastructure for its geographic reality.
They platted far too many towns on the map, laid down thousands of miles of unnecessary railroad track, opened way too many small-town banks.
Built too many local schools and redundant government institutions, and ultimately brought in hundreds of thousands of too many people for what the land could actually sustainably support in the long term.
Because at its core, and this is the vital environmental truth, North Dakota is a subhumid grassland.
Exactly. We need to define subhumid grassland. It means the region operates on a permanent, structural precipitation deficit.
It is not the lush, easy, well-watered paradise the marketing pamphlets promised the German immigrants. Rainfall is highly variable, often localized, and frequently insufficient for dense agriculture.
Drought is not a rare anomaly there. Drought is a regular, expected feature of the climate cycle. The environment is harsh, stark, and dictates its own unforgiving terms.
Therefore, the idea of giving everyone a 160-acre homestead and expecting them to thrive was a geographic delusion. You need thousands of acres to survive a drought year.
Robinson argued that because the state's entire foundational infrastructure was overbuilt based on a false, marketing-driven premise, it was doomed to a painful, protracted future.
He stated clearly that the state would face a binary choice. It would either have to slowly, painfully revert back to a natural grassland as people starved out and left,
Or the population would have to rationally, purposefully control its government and aggressively lower its expectations to adjust to the stark reality of the land.
basically, he looked at the empty ghost towns created by the 1905 Railway War and said, that isn't just a corporate mistake. That is a microcosm of the entire state's trajectory. And as you can imagine, the political establishment absolutely hated this book.
Oh, I can completely understand why politicians despise this theory. If you are a governor or a Chamber of Commerce president trying to attract outside investment and new businesses to your state, the absolute last thing you want is the state's preeminent historian publishing a book that tells the entire country, hey, we actually capped out our geographic potential in 1890, and everything we've built since then is essentially a structural mistake.
The sources mention that politicians, like a state official named Joe Satrum, openly and bitterly blamed Robinson's book for inspiring a whole generation of state leaders to adopt a defeatist attitude and lower their expectations for the state's economic future.
They wanted cheerleaders who believed the state could grow endlessly through sheer willpower, and Robinson was telling them the environment had a hard mathematical cap.
But whether the civic boosters and politicians liked his terminology or not, Robinson had tapped into a profound, undeniable truth that the state's writers, poets, and artists have always intrinsically understood.
If you are a newcomer moving to the state today, understanding this cultural mindset is absolutely essential. When you look at North Dakotan literature, whether it's historical fiction, modern poetry, or personal memoirs, the narrative constantly, obsessively revolves around the land.
It's unavoidable. It is the main character of every story. The literature highlights the immense, almost spiritual beauty of the wide-open spaces, but it constantly contrasts that beauty with the land's total unforgivingness.
It explores the deep solace of the prairie, juxtaposed against the terrifying, stark uniformity of a winter blizzard. The literature acknowledges a fundamental truth. This landscape demands incredible, grueling physical and psychological hard work just to survive on a baseline level, let alone thrive.
The fundamental relationship between the human beings and the landscape has barely shifted a single degree since La Vérendrye first walked into those Mandan villages in 1738.
The tools and the technology have certainly evolved. We have transitioned from trading knife river flint to operating massive satellite-guided combine harvesters and utilizing complex hydraulic fracturing rigs. But the core underlying negotiation with the harsh environment remains exactly the same.
You either adapt to what the subhumid grassland allows, or the grassland expels you.
It really is an incredible, humbling perspective when you pull back and view this entire historical timeline. We started this deep dive with the Mandan tribes, brilliantly managing vast continent-spanning trade networks from their permanent fortified hubs on the Missouri River.
We watched the Gilded Age railroad barons violently carve up the prairie, aggressively planting fake towns like chess pieces just to blockade their corporate rivals.
We saw the fiercely independent Germans from Russia arriving after fleeing the Tsar, desperate to plant sugar beets and protect their isolated culture, only to find themselves trapped in an unregulated economic system that slowly bled them dry through debt.
Which, in turn, sparked one of the most incredible, counterintuitive political uprisings in American history, the Nonpartisan League, where conservative rural farmers essentially hijacked the Republican Party and enacted a socialist framework of state-owned banks and grain mills simply to survive the predations of the free market.
A desperate survival instinct that eventually morphed into a fierce, uncompromising national isolationism during the Cold War, driven by a deep-seated fear that globalism would destroy their localized agrarian peace.
And finally, we arrive at the modern era, where over a century of declining rural population and farm consolidation is suddenly, violently reversed by the back-and-oil boom, bringing a massive new wave of highly educated young people searching, somewhat ironically, for a pristine natural environment and a quiet, safe life amidst the oil derricks.
It is an absolutely wild, completely nonlinear historical ride.
It truly is a history defined by extremes. If we connect this all back to the bigger picture, the foundational struggle of North Dakota is the eternal human struggle of balancing immense, boundless human ambition against the stark, unyielding mathematical realities of nature.
Which leaves me with one final lingering thought that I can't shake.
Yeah.
If historian Elwyn Robinson was fundamentally right about the 19th century too much mistake, if he was correct that the state massively overbuilt its railroads, its banking towns, and its agricultural infrastructure for an environment that simply couldn't sustain it long term.
It forces us to ask, how will historians a century from now view the massive, rapid, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure boom happening right now to support the back in oil fields?
Exactly. Are we currently witnessing the birth of a sustainable, technologically advanced new era for the state that will last centuries?
Or is this massive influx of people and capital just the 21st century version of the 1905 Railway War?
Is it just a temporary, frantic corporate frenzy destined to eventually exhaust the resource, fade away, and leave its own beautiful, stark, multi-million-dollar ruins out on the prairie grass?
Only time and the ultimate carrying capacity of the land will tell.
Something to seriously think about the next time you look at a map, or the next time you fly over the upper Midwest and assume it's just empty space. Thank you, The Learner, for sending us these incredible historical sources and for prompting us to take this journey.
We hope this custom deep dive delivered the perspective you were looking for.
To all our listeners, keep asking difficult questions, keep looking beneath the surface narratives, and always remember to question the history buried in the earth beneath your feet.